Hi, my name is Vince. In today's video, I'm going to talk about C# coding guidelines and practices. It's a fact that coding standards are arbitrary. However, the key to a successful maintainable project is not which standards you follow, but that you are consistent. Keep in mind that this video isn't about how you should indent your code, like tabs versus spaces, and the placement of your curly braces. But it's more of a practice on how to make clean code that are easy to manage. If you're leading a team or a single contributor software engineer who wanted to become better, having a set of coding guidelines is a great start to make that happen. In this video, I will highlight the list of software engineering coding guidelines in general. Most of these are industry-wide conventions, and thus using them will ensure that your code is easily readable by people who are not you. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Tip number 1. Try to avoid the classic if-else statements. Instead, use ternary conditional operator like this. This way it's more clean, easier to read and understand, and it's more concise. Tip number 2. Try to avoid multiple if statements for null checks. Instead, use null conditional operator like this. This way, it's easier to read and understand and thus to maintain, and it's also more concise. Tip number 3. Try to avoid complex if-else statements for null checks. Instead, use null coalescing operator. Just like tip number 2, this makes your code more easier to understand and more concise. Thus, it's also easier to maintain. Tip number 4. Avoid code without braces for single conditional if statement, for, and for each loops. Instead, always use braces. Without braces, it is too easy to accidentally add a second line thinking it is included in the if condition check, when it's not. Tip number 5. Try to avoid multiple if-else statements. Instead, use switch statements, or prefer to use switch expressions. Switch expressions are easier to read, easier to understand and maintain, and it's more concise. Note that this expression is only available in C#8. Keep in mind that there are cases that the if-else statements would make more sense than using switch statements or switch expressions. For example, if the condition involves different objects and complex conditions. So use your judgment to whatever works better. Tip number 6. Do not use the constructor when initializing a default value. The same applies for legacy property syntax. Instead, use inline initialization with auto-implemented properties. This way, it's very concise, clean, and easy to understand. Tip number 7. Avoid concatenating strings with the plus sign. Instead, use string.format, or prefer using string interpolation where possible. This way it's more concise, fluid, and clean, which makes it easier to understand. Tip number 8. Try to avoid string.format method when formatting simple objects. Instead, use string interpolation. This way, it's easier to read and clean compared to string.format and composite formatting. However, There are cases that the string.format method would make sense to use, especially when dealing with complex formatting and data manipulation. So again, use your good judgment when to apply it in situations. Tip number 9. Avoid using specific type for complex objects when defining variables. Instead, use the var keyword. Using the var keyword removes clutter, particularly with complex generic types. Type is easily detected with Visual Studio tooltips. Facilitates programming in that you don't necessarily need to know the type when invoking methods that return certain types. The same goes for other local variables. Try to use the var keyword where possible. Tip number 10. Try to avoid one-liner method implementation with brackets. Instead, use expression-bodied implementation. This lets you provide a member or method implementation in a very concise and readable form. Tip number 11. Avoid object initialization like this. Instead, use object and collection initializers. This way it's much cleaner and easy to understand. Tip number 12. Try to avoid the following when checking a parameter for null. Do this instead with trailing exclamation symbol. This way it's more clean and removes extra cluttering in your code when checking for nulls. This feature has been added to C# 9.0. The trailing or exclamation symbol ensures that the parameter should not be null before going inside the method implementation. Tip number 13. Avoid creating an object just to return two simple result sets. Instead, use tuples. This way it's more convenient, easy access to objects, and manipulating the dataset. Tuples replaces the need to create a new class whose sole purpose is to carry around the data. Tip number 14. Try to use extension methods to perform common tasks. This code is perfectly fine and should handle datetime conversion safely. However, the code is kinda long to just do a basic conversion. Imagine you have a lot of the same conversion cluttering within the different areas of your project. This could be messy and may cost you a lot of development time. To avoid that, you should consider creating some helper functions to do common tasks such as conversions. The preceding code can be translated to the following using extension method. And use the extension method like in the following anywhere in your code. This gives you convenience, make your code more concise, clean, and easy to understand. Now, if you don't want to write your own helper function every time you build a new project or create a new project, I've created a library called HelpMate.Core that provides common extension methods for doing this kind of stuff. You can just plug this package into your project and then you're good to go. For more information about this library, I'll leave a link down in the description below, so make sure to check it out. Tip number 15. Try to avoid the following when initializing private and read-only properties. This code is pretty much common in writing C# code for implementing dependency injection. With the release of C# 9.0, we can now let the constructor do the object initialization automatically. This removes cluttering your code with private member declarations, which can make your code cleaner. Now, in situations like if you wanted one of these properties to be publicly accessible, you could define and set one of those in the constructor. Otherwise, the arguments will be privately accessible as fields. Tip number 16. Avoid system type names like int32, string, or boolean with the capital letters. Instead, use predefined names. This is to be consistent with the Microsoft .NET Framework and makes your code more natural to read. Tip number 17. Don't use initials as identifier abbreviations. The main reason for this is that it can cause confusion and inconsistency when you have a class that represents the same initials such as this. In this case, we now have an object, person manager, and product manager with the same initials. So this can create inconsistency in your code. Instead, choose clarity over brevity. Now this makes the developers understand the code easily, as it clearly suggests what the object is about. Tip number 18. Do organize namespaces with a clearly defined structure. Generally, namespaces should reflect the folder hierarchy within a project. This maintains good organization of your code, allowing you to navigate between layers easily. Tip number 19. Use singular form, noun or noun phrases to name a class. This enables you to easily identify if the class holds single entity value or collections. It's just kinda weird to have a list of persons in the code versus a list of person. So choose which one makes sense for you. Tip number 20. Use nouns or adjective phrases for property names as well. Property names should be nouns, noun phrases, or adjectives. When naming Boolean properties, you may add the prefixes can, is, or has, so it provides value to the caller, such as in this example. Tip number 21. Use Pascal casing for class, method, and property names. This is to be consistent with the Microsoft .NET Framework and easy to read. Tip number 22. Use camel case for method arguments and local variables. Again, this is to be consistent with the Microsoft .NET Framework and makes your code easy to read. Tip number 23. Use meaningful and self-explanatory names for classes, methods, and properties. This makes your code clean, easier to read and understand by just looking at the name itself. In other words, providing meaningful names doesn't need you to write comments in the code anymore, because the developer will be able to understand what kind of data the method is fetching. Tip number 24. Do suffix asynchronous methods with the async word. This gives clarity to the method. It enables you to easily identify between a synchronous method versus synchronous method by just looking at the name itself. Tip number 25. Do prefix interfaces with the capital letter I, because it makes sense, and in fact, it's a well-known standard for defining interfaces. Tip number 26. Do prefix global variables and class members with underscores. This is to easily differentiate between local and global variables identifiers. Tip number 27. Do declare all member variables at the top of a class with static variables at the very top. This is just a generally accepted practice that prevents the need to hunt for variable declarations. Tip number 28. Do use shorthand names only when they're generally known. Every developers that work on a specific project should already know what are aggregators and data managers. For this example, we have order service output aggregator and order response manager. So instead of writing the whole entire object name, we can just name the variable as order manager and order aggregator. The same thing with FTP, UI, and IO, and so on. So again, it's okay to use abbreviations to name things, but only if they are widely known and used. It would be counterproductive not to do so. Tip number 29. Avoid underscores in between identifier names. This is because C# isn't Postgres. Just kidding. Seriously, it's to be consistent with the Microsoft.NET Framework and makes your code more natural to read. Also, it avoids underline stress or inability to see underline. Tip number 30. Do not use screaming caps for constant or read-only variables. Caps grab too much attention, so don't use it. Tip number 31. Do not use Hungarian notation or any other type identification in identifiers, except interfaces. This is because we're not students anymore. Again, just kidding. Visual Studio IDE makes determining types very easily via tooltips. In general, you want to avoid type indicators in any identifier. Tip number 32. Enum names should be singular and do not use the enum suffix in enum type names. Again, this is to be consistent with the Microsoft.NET Framework and consistent with prior rule of no type indicators in identifiers. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video or find it useful, please don't forget to like, share this with your friends, and subscribe to my channel for more videos. Again, thank you, and hope to see you soon in my next video.